Hello, my name is Professor Owen McIntyre from the School of Law, University College Cork, and I want to take a few moments to talk to you about the problem of marine plastic pollution and about the legal difficulties of addressing marine plastic pollution through regulation. If I could start, I suppose one could describe marine plastic pollution as a classic wicked problem, as a difficult or almost insoluble problem. The problem is now very high profile. It's been highlighted increasingly by civil society groups, by campaigners, by scientists. Notably, it was highlighted in recent years by the Blue Planet natural documentary or nature documentary hosted by David Attenborough. But why is it a wicked problem? Well, it's a wicked problem for a number of reasons. First of all, we're very unclear about the impacts of marine plastic pollution. We realise it's a serious problem, and it's serious aesthetically, it's serious in terms of its impact on wildlife, but we don't really fully understand the true ecological impacts or human health impacts. These remain uncertain. Particularly in respect of microplastics. Plastic waste and plastic litter in the oceans breaks down over time due to sunlight and wave action and erosion into microplastics, but we also introduce microplastics through the use of their use in certain cosmetics, through washing certain types of synthetic textiles and fabrics. So there's a big load of microplastics finding their way into the oceans and finding their way into our food chains, and we don't really understand the impacts of these as yet. But the true reason that it's a wicked problem is that it presents very, very, very complex regulatory challenges. And as lawyers, our job is to try to address these challenges. First of all, it presents a classic example of the fragmentation of environmental regulatory measures or of environmental law. And by fragmentation, I mean that they break down into a number of different fields. So, and we look at these fields in a moment. So there are a range of different areas of regulatory activity, and these overlap and are sometimes mutually contradictory. The fields, the bodies of law that each of which seek to address the problem of marine plastic pollution, these may be fragmented horizontally in that we seek to address it through different bodies of law, and vertically, so that we may have different positions in national law, in EU law, in international law. If we think about the areas of law, the bodies of rules that seek to address this, the obvious one is rules on marine environmental pollution. And they do seek to address, not very successfully so far, but they seek to address the problem of marine plastic pollution. But the more one looks at that, the more one discovers that really this is not a problem that originates in the marine space. Marine environmental law regulates activities in the marine space, pollution from ships, the dumping of waste from ships, the wildlife at sea, the wildlife living resources, biodiversity in the ocean. So these are not the source of plastics. So these measures are always going to be rather ineffective. Also, international biodiversity law, we know that these pollutants, these substances, this litter impacts on wildlife. We've all seen pictures of seabirds and cetaceans and sea mammals choking, seeking to ingest plastic, all sorts of creatures, and plastics finding their way into the food chain and up through the chain of life. So international biodiversity law tries to tackle it, but in a rather different way than marine pollution law. One of the things we do know is that the vast majority of marine litter finds its way into the ocean as outfall from rivers. So rivers carry plastic waste into the oceans. So maybe it's a problem of freshwater law or water pollution law or river law. And again, that's likely to be a much more effective way of addressing marine pollution by plastic than marine environmental law. But even then, we haven't moved far enough upstream. We haven't moved close enough to the source to effectively regulate. That would require that we look at waste management law. How are we managing waste? You know, why is that waste finding its way as litter or as the broken down byproduct of waste treatment? Why is that finding its way into water resources, into rivers, into soils often, then into rivers, and from rivers into oceans? And in fact, when we start to look at the problem from the waste management perspective, we start to see this goes way beyond that even. We have to move further upstream. And we have to look at measures to promote and encourage sustainable production and consumption. Really, perhaps we ought not to be using these plastics, these particular plastics, or using so much plastic, or maybe we should be reusing plastic or only allowing the use of reusable plastics. That feeds into another paradigm, an emerging paradigm globally, but probably being led by the EU. We call the circular economy paradigm, which is really the idea of stopping the production of waste, stopping to think of byproducts as waste and to think of them as raw materials so that everything will be reused. Now, that involves very fundamental changes in our legal frameworks, from the design of products and the packaging they come in, to changes in our waste management to ensure that many waste products can more easily be reused, and to changes in our chemicals legislation to make sure that we choose materials, including plastics, that have a different chemical makeup. So we find this is a classic wicked problem. This, every time we find a solution, it slips out of our hands and moves further upstream. Another major problem here is the transnational character of the plastics industry. The plastics industry is global, and it is involved centrally and intrinsically involved in global supply chains. That's in terms of the production of plastic products. In terms of the production, or in terms of all internationally traded goods, all of which are shipped across borders to some degree or other using plastic packaging and plastic components, but also the treatment and disposal of plastic waste. In Europe, we have traditionally exported a great deal of our plastic waste to China, to Southeast Asia. In fact, to parts of the world that have less infrastructure, that have less capacity, that are less able to deal with that waste. And then we wonder how it ends up in the ocean, and we wonder whose fault that is. So therefore, we can also look at something even beyond law, or something that is not yet fully legal in character. And we often refer to this as transnational environmental law, much of which is informal in character or quasi-legal in character. These are other sub-legislative or sub-legal governance frameworks. And the benefit of these frameworks is that they regulate the activity, or they influence the activity of producers of products, plastic and others, manufacturers of plastic products and other products that come wrapped in plastic, of exporters, of importers, of distributors, of retailers, and most importantly, of consumers. And they help consumers to make choices that rely less on the most damaging plastics. What do these governance frameworks look like? Well, there's a whole range of types of schemes. They may be labelling and certification schemes, so that you can receive, you can select products as a consumer or as a purchaser, within business, of products that come with some form of credible green certification, and plastic must be integrated into, or the lack of plastic must be integrated into these labelling and certification schemes. They may be incorporated into global sustainability norms, things like the UN Global Compact, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, into the CSR, corporate social responsibility policies of individual companies. The vast majority of large companies do have commitments that they themselves make and police on environmental and social responsibility. Within environmental management systems that most large corporate actors use, for example, the ISO, International Standards Organization, Standard 26000, to do with social responsibility, the social responsibility guidance standards. They may be in relation to certain types of products built into the environmental and social safeguards of multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the European Investment Bank that would no longer fund projects that promote, manufacture, rely upon plastic and produce plastic pollution. So there's a range of ways that these transnational governance frameworks can assist where the law is struggling. And there's a complex relationship between transnational environmental frameworks, governance frameworks, and formal law. I would not argue that global governance frameworks, these informal and often non-binding global governance frameworks, would be a substitute for formal legal frameworks. Treaties at the international level, I think there really should be a treaty to, over many years, possibly decades, progressively, incrementally ban plastics. I think we will come to that eventually, but we're not ready for that yet. It wouldn't work as yet. So they're no substitute for formal frameworks like treaties or national legislation, statutes within countries. But these frameworks do fill regulatory gaps, they lacunae. They address deficiencies in our formal laws, and our formal laws are not coping with marine plastic pollution at the moment. They also promote the evolution of more progressive formal legal frameworks. The law very often can easily legislate for what is achievable, what is manageable, what is already possible and reasonably cheap. And so these governance frameworks promote and nudge a move in the right direction, which makes the adoption and the agreement of law easier. Also, in that regard, they change the conditions on the ground, that if they were to have an impact on the worst polluting plastics, on the worst processes and sources of marine plastic pollution, by, for example, promoting substitute products, bioplastics or biodegradable plastics, that in itself would change conditions on the ground to make it easier to agree and implement formal legislation. So a complex picture. One of the reasons I present this complex picture to you is I want to give you a sense of the type of challenges, the type of puzzles that we seek to understand, to address, and ultimately to solve. Thank you very much.